She was sleeping on a mattress on the floor in Queens, 5 months pregnant, with an eviction notice in her hand and $0 in her account. Her husband, a billionaire, had packed her things into boxes, cut off her bank access, canceled her lease, and blocked her number, all in one night. Why? Because she was, in his words, not built for this life. And he walked away with his mistress on his arm. He walked away laughing. But here's what Derek Voss never counted on: the woman he threw away had unknowingly signed her name on every single one of his crimes. And the most dangerous man on Wall Street had just knocked on her door. What happens next shattered Derek's empire, destroyed his mistress, and put Elena's name in every boardroom in Manhattan, not as a victim, but as the most powerful witness in the biggest corporate fraud of the decade. Stay with me, because this story is going to make you believe that the quietest women carry the loudest truth. The people who underestimate you are building the very weapon that will destroy them. If this story moved you even a little hit, like drop a comment telling me what you felt in the first 60 seconds, share it with someone who needs to hear it, and subscribe so you never miss a story like this. I'll be right here.
It's funny. Just 8 months before that night, I was a completely different person. My life was so wonderfully normal. A small job, a cozy little apartment with my husband, Derek, and this simple dream of starting a family. I wasn't someone you'd ever notice in a crowd, and I was fine with that. I loved Derek with a sincerity that feels a little naive now. Back then, he wasn't a billionaire mogul. He was just a man with a dream, chasing deals and burning through our savings. I was his biggest believer, his rock. I worked extra shifts to keep us afloat, made cheap dinners, and told him he could do it when he was ready to quit. I was his anchor. But the moment his company struck gold, everything shifted. Suddenly, this man I loved was gone, replaced by someone I didn't recognize. He started staying out late, smelling of expensive cologne that wasn't for me. Soon, the rumors started, and then she appeared. Leah Crane, the woman hired to polish his new, shiny image. I tried so hard not to see it, to believe in the vows we'd made. The night it all ended is seared into my memory. I just found out I was pregnant, and I was so excited, thinking it would fix everything. I had the little ultrasound picture ready for him. He came home after midnight, with her on his arm. He wasn't even sorry. He just waved a hand and said, "Let's not make a scene. Leah and I are together now." I remember my voice shaking when I said we were married. "For now," he said, his voice like ice. "You're not built for this life." When I told him I was pregnant, his face went blank. He leaned in and whispered the cruelest thing I'd ever heard. "Then you'll handle it. A baby would be bad for my image right now." The next morning, all my things were in boxes on the curb. He'd cut off my access to our money, canceled the lease, and blocked my number. He left me with absolutely nothing but the tiny new life inside me. For months, I survived in a rundown apartment in Queens on instant noodles, crying myself to sleep. I thought my story was over. I had no idea that fate was sending help from the one person Derek feared most. That place in Queens wasn't much of an apartment, really. It was more of a box on the 4th floor, Unit 4C, with cracking walls and a noisy radiator. That was all I could manage after Derek kicked me out. I kept telling myself it was just for a little while. The neighborhood wasn't bad, just gray. The smell of wet pavement and street food was the air I breathed. Every morning started with a battle against nausea. I'd just hold onto the sink and whisper to myself, "Just get through today." It was a lonely time. I wrapped my coat around myself on the way to work, not for the cold, but to hide my growing belly from strangers' eyes. My pregnancy, which should have been a joy, felt like a secret I had to keep. But the loneliness wasn't even the worst part. The rumors were, Derek's people were good. Friends and old coworkers started looking at me sideways, whispering that I'd trapped him for his money. To them, I was the villain. I learned to keep my head down, eat my cheap lunch alone, and hide in the bathroom for 5 minutes just to breathe. At night, I'd sit on the mattress on the floor and put my hands over my belly, talking to you. I'd promise I was trying my best to make things right. But promises don't pay the bills. One evening, I came home exhausted to find a yellow notice taped to my door. A final eviction warning. That was it. That was the moment I finally broke. I just slid down to the floor and sobbed, holding that piece of paper. Then, in the middle of it all, my phone buzzed. An unknown number. Something told me I had to answer it. A man's voice, very calm, said, "My name is Adrian Cole. I believe you need help." I just froze. Honey. I'd never met the man, but everybody in the city knew that name. Adrian Cole. Before I could even think of what to say, he added, "I'm outside your building. Please open the door." My world just stopped turning. Sitting there on the floor, I could hear the city buzzing outside my window, but everything for me went silent. He wasn't just a name, he was a legend. Wall Street's invisible king. My life was about to change completely. Decision. It's funny, looking back, my world had already crumbled, and then the phone rang. It was him. I was so sure it was a mistake. I remember my voice trembling when I said, "I think you have the wrong number." But his voice was so calm, so certain. It cut right through my panic. He said he knew what happened, and that he was right outside my door. Oh, honey, my heart just about leaped out of my chest. I remember stumbling to the door, the weight of you pressing under my ribs, trying to look even a little presentable, which was laughable. When I finally got both locks undone, the cold December air rushed in, and there he was, taller than in pictures, with snowflakes caught in his dark hair. He looked around my little apartment, at the flickering light and the stacks of unpaid bills, but his eyes held no pity, only this quiet, fierce anger that wasn't aimed at me. That was the first thing that struck me. When he asked to come in, I was so embarrassed by the state of my life. I mumbled an apology, but he just shook his head and said, I'd been through enough. Shame was a constant companion back then, wrapping around me so tightly I could barely breathe. I asked him why he was there, because no one even called me anymore. He looked at me so gently and told me I deserved better. My throat went tight. Of course I didn't believe him. I was sure I knew the whole story, but he knew enough. He knew Derek, and he knew what men like him do to people who get in their way. My chest ached just hearing Derek's name. I accused him of using me for revenge, of course. It was the only thing that made any sense. But he stepped a little closer and told me if he wanted revenge, he'd had plenty of other chances. Oh, he said. He was there because he saw a woman fighting all by herself when she shouldn't have had to be. I tried so hard not to cry. You know how I hate crying in front of strangers, but his steadiness just broke down the walls I'd built. "I'm not strong," I whispered, and without even a pause he said, "Yes, you are. You just forgot." There he was, this impossibly put-together man in my broken little world. He held out a simple card and said he could help me rebuild everything. I hesitated for so long, trusting the wrong man had destroyed my life. Could I really trust another? But I reached out and took the card, and I could see something shift in his eyes. That one small decision, honey, it ended up changing everything. The next morning, I just sat on that lumpy mattress, staring at his business card like it was an artifact from another planet. Cole and Hawthorne Capital. Even the fancy letters felt like they belonged to a world I couldn't touch. I'd barely slept, just replaying his calm voice, the way he stood in my doorway like a quiet storm. It all felt so unreal. Powerful men didn't climb 4 flights of rickety stairs in Queens for women like me. A knock on the door made me jump, but it wasn't him. It was Mrs. Calderon, my sweet old neighbor from down the hall, holding a little paper bag with breakfast. She was always looking out for me back then. She touched my arm and said, "You're stronger than you think, mija." I wished so badly I could believe her. After she left, I got dressed, pulling on that old sweater, the one with the elbows worn thin. I looked in that cracked mirror and just saw a tired, pregnant woman trying not to fall apart. But I picked up his card again. "I can help you rebuild." It had sounded impossible. But then, so had everything else that had happened. So had surviving it all. I figured, if impossible bad things could happen, maybe an impossible good thing could too. Just before noon, I made up my mind and walked out the door. Park Avenue. Goodness, those buildings seemed to scrape the clouds. I stood there, feeling so small, tugging at my sleeves while shiny black cars slid past. Everyone looked like they owned the world. I felt like I was from a different species entirely. Inside, the marble floors shone so brightly. I felt so out of place. But then, as I walked toward the elevators, I saw it. A giant news screen. And there was his face, your father's face, looking polished and proud. Beside him was Leah Crane. The headline was about some new business deal. My breath just caught in my throat. I felt my eyes start to sting. I was fighting back tears when I heard someone say my name. It was Adrian, standing there in a perfect suit, but his expression softened the moment he saw me. "You came," he said, his voice low. I nodded, admitting I'd almost run away. "I'm glad you didn't," he replied, and led me to a private elevator. As the doors closed, all the city noise just disappeared. He told me that I had something valuable. I almost laughed. I had nothing left. But he looked me right in my eyes and said, "You have the truth." And truth, he said, was the one thing men like Derek could never control. He said he needed someone with truth, someone willing to fight back. That phrase, fight back, felt strange and powerful. When the elevator doors opened to his office, overlooking all of Manhattan, for the first time in months, I felt a tiny flicker of possibility. Now, I didn't know it then, but seeing me walk in with Adrian had really shaken your father. Derek built his empire on never being surprised, on always being the smartest man in the room. But that night, something in his perfect world started to crack. He tried to act like it didn't bother him, of course, hiding behind that arrogance of his. He wanted to believe I was still that helpless girl he'd thrown away. But the image of me standing next to Adrian apparently played over and over in his mind. And people noticed. Investors whispered. Board members gave each other looks. I heard even Leah Crane, lounging in his penthouse, which she was reading him the gossip columns, sighing about how everyone was taking my side. She glows while the billionaire's mistress looks cheap. Can you imagine? Your father just snapped, asking why I was even there. Leah, of all people, was the one to point out the obvious. Maybe she belongs there now. He gave her a cold look, but even she had seen how Adrian stood beside me. Protective and sure. That doesn't just happen by accident. She suggested Adrian was using me, but Derek just scoffed. He said I couldn't even manage a budget, so how could I be useful? But she kept asking, then why was he at her side? Derek didn't have an answer, because for the first time, something didn't make sense in his world. The next morning, at his fancy headquarters, he was still in a terrible mood. His own employees were giving him strange looks, and he noticed. He couldn't see them, but he could feel them. He locked himself in his office and started looking at reports, trying to find comfort in numbers. But it didn't work, because one name kept popping up where it shouldn't. Cole and Hawthorne Capital. Adrian's firm was quietly buying small companies connected to his. Nothing illegal, just a chill running down his spine. What is he planning? He muttered to himself. Then his assistant buzzed him. A reporter was asking for a comment. He snarled. No comment. Then another pause, and then she told him. Mr. Varelli from the board had asked if he knew Adrian Cole was seen meeting with two of their biggest investors. Derek shot up from his chair. What? His assistant said it looked friendly. Friendly, that was the moment he knew, was a dangerous game. You see, being friendly meant building alliances, and alliances meant power. And power, my dear, was the very thing that could ruin him. I learned later that his heart was pounding. Me, Elena, a woman he'd dismissed as nothing, had suddenly become a problem. And Adrian, a man he'd completely misjudged, was circling. I can just picture Derek slamming his fist on that big desk of his. Elena can't be part of this. She isn't smart enough. But even then, he remembered how I looked at the restaurant. Calm, collected, not the woman he'd broken months before. He felt something shift, not guilt, but a loss of control. That night, I heard he'd just scrolled through my old posts. I hadn't put up anything new, and in his world, silence was the loudest alarm bell. He probably sat there with his expensive scotch and thought, if Adrian wants a fight, I'll show Elena who's really in charge. He didn't know it then, but threatening me was the worst mistake he would ever make. And then there was Lila Crane. She always thought she knew about power. Not real power, like Derek's, but the flashy, cheap kind she'd built her life around. Gossip, headlines, making other people jealous. She had charmed and schemed her way into Derek's circle, a master at using a smile as a weapon. So when that grainy photo of me and Adrian appeared online, she felt something she hadn't in a long time. Fear. I can see her now, sitting in Derek's kitchen, scrolling through those comments as the cold sun hit the counters. Is that Adrian Cole with Elena Foster? What an upgrade. She looks classier than Lila. Best plot twist of the year. Her perfectly painted nails must have dug into her phone. What is this? She would have snapped as Derek walked in, fixing his tie. He'd glance at the screen, his jaw tight. It's nothing. Nothing? Her voice would have risen. Your ex-wife looks like she's on a magazine cover with Adrian Cole. Do you know what that does to your image? I don't care about Adrian, Derek must have mumbled. Oh, please. I can just hear the sarcasm in Lila's voice. You should, because everyone is making up stories, Derek. Stories where you're the bitter, insecure one who got left behind. He would have flinched, just a little. Lila would have seen it, and a smile would have crossed her face. Seeing fear in a man like that was like a drug to her. And worse, she'd continue, leaning against the counter. They're calling Elena the sympathetic one. That word, I was told, hit him like a punch. Elena, Derek spat out my name. She knows nothing about this world. Lila's smile would have gotten sharper. Good. Then she won't know how to survive what's coming. Derek would have looked at her then. What are you planning? What you should have done from the start. Her eyes would have gleamed. Control the story. Ruin her before she becomes a real threat. He paused. She saw her chance. Don't go soft, she'd say. She's not your wife anymore. She's a problem. Derek didn't answer, but his silence was all the permission she needed. That same afternoon, Lila sat in her sleek office, her fingers just flying. She started planting rumors, disguised as innocent chats and anonymous tips to gossip columnists. She fed stories to social media accounts that thrived on drama. Her version of events spread like a virus. Elena Foster, the schemer, manipulating billionaire Adrian Cole, pregnant ex-wife out for revenge? Sources say she's using the baby to get back her money and status. But Lila wasn't done. She found an old photo of me crying outside a subway station from months before, a day I had actually fainted from being overworked and sick. She sent it to a tabloid, claiming it showed I was unstable and desperate for money. It was cruel, and it was effective. Within hours, the internet turned on me. I didn't see any of it at first. I was in Adrian's office, looking over some spreadsheets. He'd wanted my opinion on when my phone started vibrating off the hook. Notifications just kept piling up. My stomach knotted. I clicked on one, and my heart just plummeted. There were dozens, then hundreds of comments pouring in. Horrible accusations, vicious lies. A kind of cruelty from strangers that felt deeply personal. My hands started to shake. Adrian noticed right away. "Elena?" he asked, his voice soft. I tried to answer, but my throat was too tight. I just turned my phone so he could see. For a second, his expression was completely blank. No twitch, no blink, nothing. Then, his eyes went dark with a cold, terrifying anger I had never witnessed before. "This wasn't Derrick," Adrian said. "This is her. Lila," I whispered, my voice breaking. "Yes." He stood up so slowly, every single movement deliberate, deadly. "And she just made a mistake she will live to regret." I swallowed hard. "What do we do now?" Adrian looked right at me, not with pity, but with a firm resolve. "Now," he said, "we stop playing on their terms." And just like that, honey, the real fight began. I had never seen a boardroom like the one Adrian took me to. The windows went from the floor to the ceiling, framing Manhattan like a masterpiece. You could see the Hudson River sparkling in the sun and the Empire State Building standing so tall. The whole room had this scent of polished wood, leather, and something I couldn't identify, maybe just pure authority. But it wasn't the view that stole my breath. It was the enormous table, surrounded by men and women in expensive suits who all looked at me the moment I walked in. I couldn't read their faces, a mix of curiosity and maybe some suspicion or appraisal. I remember pulling my coat tighter around my belly, which was just starting to show. "Adrian," one of the men said, "is this the consultant you told us about?" Consultant. For a second, I almost turned and left, but Adrian stood right beside me, solid as a rock. "Yes," he said simply. "This is Elena Foster." My heart was beating so fast. "I know what you're all thinking," Adrian went on. "She's not from Wall Street. She's not one of us, but I trust her analysis and her insight." That silenced the room, and it shocked me. Adrian trusted me. He trusted me enough to bring me there, in front of people who managed billions of dollars. I kept my eyes down until I felt Adrian's hand gently on my elbow. "Have a seat," he said so quietly. I did as he said, my hands clammy and my heart thumping in my ears. Screens lit up, and the meeting started. For a while I just listened, almost afraid to breathe, but then Adrian brought up some financial charts, documents I had helped him with the night before. They showed strange things in Vostek's contracts, hidden expenses, numbers that just didn't add up. My stomach clenched. I knew those numbers. My own name had been on contracts like that. Derrick had made me sign so many things I didn't understand back when I thought I was helping him. I never doubted him, you see. It never crossed my mind he'd use my signature for something dishonest. "Miss Foster," one of the executives suddenly asked, "do any of these patterns seem familiar to you?" I felt my blood turn to ice. Adrian looked at me, his expression calm and reassuring. "You don't have to answer," he murmured. But I lifted my chin. "Yes," I said, and my voice shook a little. "I've seen these numbers before." A little stir went through the room. I continued, slowly at first, but then my voice got stronger. I explained the doctored expenses, the pressure Derrick would put on me to just sign things. I even told them how he'd always say, "Leave the business to me, Elena. You wouldn't get it." My face grew hot. But this time, it wasn't from shame. It was from anger. The executives all glanced at each other. One of them finally leaned in. Miss Foster, you do know that what you're describing could uncover a massive corporate fraud, don't you? I swallowed hard. I'm not trying to uncover anything. I'm just telling you what happened. Adrian's voice cut in, calm but strong. And sometimes, the truth isn't uncovering. Another executive asked, "Why would Derek use your name?" I let out a breath. Because he thought I was harmless. He thought I was invisible. He thought no one would ever believe me. The room was completely quiet. Then Adrian, who had been silent, spoke with this steady intensity. That invisibility was what he was counting on, but he miscalculated. A low murmur started around the table, but Adrian wasn't finished. From now on, he said, Elena's perspective is vital to our strategy. Anyone who underestimates her again will be making a serious error. I think my breath caught in my throat. Vital? One of the executives arched an eyebrow. You're giving her a place at this table? Adrian simply nodded. Yes, starting right now. My vision started to blur, not with fear this time, but with a feeling I didn't recognize. Strength. I had no idea what was going to happen next. I didn't know how Derek would fight back, or if I was even ready for it all. But as I looked out at that incredible view of Manhattan, with my hand resting on my belly, I understood something. For the very first time since Derek had shattered my life, I wasn't fighting by myself anymore. Just 2 days after that boardroom meeting, the world around me started to change in ways I wasn't prepared for. It wasn't loud or sudden, no big explosions, just a quiet, fundamental shift in how people saw me. They looked at me differently, spoke to me differently, all because Adrian Cole had given me something Derek had always denied me: respect. Cole and Hawthorne Capital sent out a very quiet internal memo announcing that Elena Foster was a temporary financial consultant for a confidential project. My name was right there, printed in the same document as senior executives. And even though it wasn't a public announcement, in those glass towers in Manhattan, a secret had the lifespan of a mayfly. By lunchtime, the whispers were already finding their way to my desk. Is that her? The woman with Adrian? The one Voss betrayed? I even heard one person say, she found something big, something the feds would love. Every trip in the elevator started to feel like a test of my nerve. Every look from a colleague felt heavy. Some were curious, some were admiring, a few were doubtful. But what mattered, honey, was that for the first time in months, not a single one of them held pity. Still, the pressure was immense. I was pregnant, bone-tired, and so new to this world of sharp suits and sharper smiles. I felt like I shouldn't have been there at all. And yet, looking back, I felt more at home with those wolves than I ever did in Derek's shadow. That afternoon, Adrian asked me to join him for a private investors' lunch at the Regent Club. One of those places so exclusive, you needed an invitation just to breathe the air outside. I panicked, of course. I told him I couldn't go in there. I whispered it, actually. Those were the people that you saw in magazines, on corporate boards, in politics. I was just... You're Elena, Adrian cut in, so simply. And that's all you need to be. But I just shook my head. I didn't have a thing to wear. A little smile played on Adrian's lips. He said, "That's an easy problem to solve." Before I could even protest, his assistant was there with 2 beautiful garment bags and a pair of low heels. They were simple, elegant, nothing flashy, chosen so thoughtfully for a woman who was expecting. My voice hitched when I tried to thank him. "I can't take these. You're not taking a favor," Adrian said, his voice soft but firm. "You're taking your seat at the table." By the time we arrived, I saw what he meant. The Regent Club looked just like you'd imagine. Old New York money carved right into the stone. gold sconces, oil paintings, mahogany everywhere, a place where fortunes were made and lost over quiet conversation. As I walked in beside Adrian, a little ripple of silence went through the room. Not loud, not impolite, but you could feel it. People sat up a little straighter, their eyes widened just a bit, because it wasn't just that Adrian Cole had brought a guest. It was that he had brought me. A distinguished-looking man at the head of the room, with silver hair and an air of command, stood up to greet us. "Adrienne, we weren't expecting you." "I know," Adrian said, with that polite smile of his. "This is Elena Foster. She's consulting with my firm." The man's eyes glanced at my stomach, then back to my face. It wasn't judgmental, just assessing. "Miss Foster," he said, offering his hand, "I hear you saw something our own analysts missed." I felt a blush creep up my neck. I don't know about that." "It's true," Adrian said, his voice leaving no room for argument. And with that, others turned to us, suddenly very interested. The questions started coming, smart, probing questions. What was the pattern I saw? How long did I think the books had been cooked? Why hadn't Vostek caught the problem themselves? My voice was a little shaky at first, but then my brain, the analytical part of me that I hadn't used in so long, just took over. I laid it all out for them. The phony numbers, the shuffled statements, the way the money was being moved around. I just told them the truth. And the truth, I learned that day, has its own kind of power. By the time I was done, the silver-haired man let out a long, low whistle. "Miss Foster," he said, "you may have just uncovered the beginning of the biggest corporate scandal in the last 3 years." I just blinked at him. A scandal? Because of Derek? A quiet murmur went around the table. Adrian leaned in, his voice for my ears only. "This is why I needed you here." I had to take a deep breath. Does Derek know yet?" "No," Adrian said, and his eyes were like chips of ice. "But when he does, everything he's built is going to start to crack." I let out a shaky breath as it all sank in. For the first time since Derek had tried to ruin my life, I wasn't the one being hunted. I was becoming the danger. Now, Derek Voss had always believed he was untouchable. But I learned later that for the past 48 hours, something had been off in his world. It was subtle at first, then impossible to ignore. His calls weren't getting returned. Emails were suddenly curt and polite. Meetings he was used to running felt tense. He felt people watching him. He could hear them whispering, and whenever he'd enter a room, a strange quiet would fall, like the air does right before a thunderstorm. He tried to brush it off as paranoia, but that all fell apart the moment his CFO, a man named Grant Melville, burst into his office without even knocking. "We've got a problem," Grant said, his voice tight. Derek, I was told, didn't even look up from his computer. "Grant, unless the building's on fire—" "It's worse," Grant cut him off. That got Derek's attention. Grant threw a pile of reports on his desk. "Cole and Hawthorne Capital is buying up shares in 2 of our partner companies." Quietly, "But it's happening." Derek just stared at him. So? Grant nearly yelled. "Adrian Cole doesn't make moves like that unless he's getting ready to tear someone down." Those words must have hit him hard, but Grant wasn't done. "And the board knows. They're asking questions, tough ones." Derek's heart must have been pounding. Adrian. It always came back to Adrian, or, more accurately, to me. His jaw clenched. "What did she tell him?" Derek snarled. "What lies is she spreading?" Grant, to his credit, hesitated. "I don't think they're lies, Derek." Derek slammed his fist on the desk. "She doesn't know a thing." Grant must have flinched. "She signed off on those documents," he said, his voice quiet. Derek's blood probably ran cold then. She was my wife, he snapped. I told her what to sign. That doesn't mean she understood any of it. Grant lowered his voice even more. Legally, that might not matter. A heavy, suffocating silence filled the room. Then Grant delivered the final blow. Derrick, if she goes to the SEC, you're finished. That night, Derrick went back to his penthouse. The place he once saw as his castle must have felt like a cage. He paced back and forth, calling Leia over and over. She didn't answer. Finally, after the 10th try, she picked up, sounding annoyed. What do you want? What's happening? He demanded. Why is Cole coming after me? What did you do? Leia just scoffed at him. You're the one who left his ex-wife a complete wreck, emotionally and financially. And did you honestly think she would just vanish? She doesn't have the sense for this, Derrick snapped back. Someone's using her. Leia's voice turned icy. Maybe you should have thought about respecting her instead of humiliating her. He must have frozen. It was the first time she'd ever defended me. He didn't like it one bit. Are you on my side or not? He hissed. There was a pause then, a long, dangerous silence. I'm on the side of whoever wins, she finally said, and hung up on him. His hand was trembling as he held the phone. His mistress was gone, his company was teetering, and me, the woman he thought he had buried, was coming back. The next morning, Derrick walked into the Vostek boardroom, determined to take back control. But he knew the second he walked in that the game had changed. 12 board members, all just staring at him, coldly. Derrick, the chairman said, we need to talk about the audit. He stiffened. What audit? A folder slid across that big, polished table. The words on it were stark. Colin Hawthorne, preliminary findings. Vostek anomalies. I imagine his world went a little blurry. Adrian was already moving. We'd like your cooperation, the chairman told him, and your transparency. Derrick's chest must have felt so tight. You think I'm hiding something from you? We think, the chairman said so carefully, that your ex-wife may have some knowledge that we are obligated to look into. The whole room must have tilted for him then. Elena, he whispered, completely stunned. He had tried to destroy me. He had tried to erase me. He had expected me to be silent. Instead, I had become the one person his own board wanted to hear from. He was losing his grip on his reputation, his empire, his entire, carefully built world. Derrick Voss had finally run into a force he couldn't bully or buy. And her name was Elena Foster. I never expected Adrian to come to my apartment that night, and I certainly didn't expect to see him standing there with a look on his face I had never seen before, somewhere between fiercely protective and barely contained rage. Are you all right? He asked as soon as I opened the door. When that door swung open, I still remember blinking. Yes, I think so, I'd said, and Adrienne's voice, so quiet. You're not, because something happened today. Something you deserve to know before anyone else tells you. He said Derrick's name, and my stomach just dropped. A cold, hard knot. What happened? I asked. But just the name made my chest ache. He stepped inside, and I remember him closing the door so gently behind him. His presence just filled that tiny apartment, made me feel a bit steadier, but I could feel the tension coming off him. A warning that this was big. In his hand, he held just one folder. Elena, he started. His voice was calm, but had a darkness to it. We found something new in those papers you signed for Derrick. Something he hid from you. Something that could have ruined your life. My breath caught in my throat. He put the folder on my little kitchen table. Sit. And I did. My knees felt like they'd give out. He opened it so slowly, too slowly. Elena, Those signatures connected you to transactions you should never have been a part of. I knew that, I whispered back. I knew he'd tricked me. You didn't know how much, Adrienne said, correcting me gently. These weren't for everyday expenses. They were approvals to move money into private accounts Derek set up using fake company names. I just froze. What does that mean? I asked. It means, Adrian said, choosing his words so carefully, Derek was laundering money through imaginary projects. And from a legal standpoint, your signature approved every bit of it. My pulse was just pounding in my ears. I didn't know, was all I could get out. I swear I didn't know. I know you didn't, he said, his voice so firm. But the law doesn't care about what you didn't know. If the SEC had found this before we did, you would have been their first target. A wave of dizziness washed over me. I remember putting a hand on my belly, as if I could shield you from it all. I could have gone to prison, I breathed. Adrian's jaw was tight. Yes, and Derek knew it. He was counting on that, expecting it. My vision blurred with tears then. Not from fear, but from a betrayal so deep it felt like my heart was splitting open. How could he? I choked out. How could someone who said he loved me put me in that kind of danger? Adrien knelt beside me then, his voice low and steady, because men like Derek only love themselves. Tears just streamed down my face, silent and aching. Elena, he said, so gently, there's more. I looked up at him, feeling so raw and shaky. What else? Adrienne let out a long breath. We also found out Derek kept copies of those documents. He didn't destroy them. It was almost like he was saving them to use against you later. My mouth fell open. I couldn't believe it. He wanted leverage, Adrienne went on. If you ever challenged him, he could have had you arrested. For a long time, I couldn't say a word. I couldn't even breathe right. My whole body went numb. And then, like a dam breaking, all that fear twisted into something new. Anger. Pure, clean, righteous anger. He wanted to ruin me, I whispered. He threw me out, took everything I had, humiliated me, and still kept away to destroy me if I ever tried to fight back. Adrienne just nodded. But he failed, he said softly, because you're not alone anymore, and because now we control the truth, not him. I wiped my tears, and my hands, funny enough, were suddenly steady. What do we do now? I asked. Adrian met my eyes, his gaze so calm and strong. Now, he said, we show the board what Derek tried to hide. I took a deep breath, and for the first time, the fear didn't swallow me whole. This time, I was ready to fight. The next morning was gray and sharp, the kind of New York winter day where the cold feels like a personal attack. I walked beside Adrienne through the marble lobby of his company, holding my coat a little tighter. My heart was pounding, not with fear this time, but with the weight of everything I now knew. Derek hadn't just used me, he'd built a legal trap for me that I never saw. I expected Adrienne to lead me right into another meeting, but he took me to the very top floor instead, to his private office. It was a space so quiet, it felt like it was sealed off from the rest of the world. Huge windows let in a pale light that fell across all the polished steel and dark wood. He pointed to a chair for me to sit. There's something we need to discuss before we go any further, he said. I sank into the leather chair, getting ready for more bad news. Is it about the documents? That's part of it, he answered. But this is bigger. He slid a new file across the table toward me. Elena, someone leaked to the press that you're involved in an SEC investigation. My breath just caught. What? That's not true. I haven't talked to anyone. I know, Adrienne said, perfectly calm. But what people think can do damage, even if it's not real. He opened the file. Headlines just stared up at me. They were ugly, loud, and so cruel. Derek Voss's ex-wife named in financial inquiry. Sources say Elena Foster expected to testify. And the worst one? Pregnancy used for sympathy. Insider questions motives. My chest tightened up so painfully. Leia did this, I said. It was a certainty. Absolutely, Adrienne agreed. And Derek let her. The betrayal tasted like metal in my mouth. But why now? I whispered. Why drag me into it? Adrienne held my gaze. Because they believe the easiest way to save themselves is to break you before you can become a credible witness. For a second, I felt that old fear rising up. Cold, choking, and so familiar. It took me right back to those nights, crying alone in Queens, Israel, terrified I'd never get away from Derek. But this time was different. I made myself take a deep breath to get steady. What do we do? I asked. Adrian leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table, his voice low. We give them what they fear most. My brow furrowed. The truth, he explained. But we control how it gets out. Not them, not the press, not Derek. He pulled out another whiz paper, a timeline of every single crooked transfer Derek had made using my name. My stomach was in knots. All of this with my signature. Yes. His voice wasn't soft anymore, just full of resolve. And that's why the next move has to be precise. We can't let them control the narrative. I swallowed hard. You think I should go public with it? I think, Adrienne said, that the board will demand you testify very soon. And when they do, Derek will panic. He'll start making mistakes, dangerous ones. I stared at those papers, my hands trembling. What if I mess it up? I asked. My voice was barely a whisper. What if they don't believe me? Adrian moved from behind his desk and knelt right beside my chair. He wasn't a CEO in that moment, or a strategist. He was just a man, trying to ground me. Elena, listen to me. You survived the worst of Derek long before I ever showed up. You went through things most people couldn't imagine. And you're still here. I blinked, trying to hold back tears. You're not weak, he said softly. You were isolated, manipulated, and lied to. But you were never weak. My breath was shaky. For once, Adrian added, you're walking into a battle with someone at your back. I wiped my eyes and gave him a little nod. Okay, I whispered. Let's do it. Just then, a sharp knock came at the door. Adrienne stood up, smoothing his suit jacket. Come in. His assistant stepped inside, her face pale. Sir, you need to see this. She handed Adrian a tablet. He glanced at the screen, and his expression just hardened into steel. What is it? I asked. Adrian turned the tablet so I could see it. It was a leaked internal memo from Vostek, calling for me, Elena Foster, to appear before the board. Immediately, my world just tilted on its axis. They're trying to corner you, Adrienne said. No. I whispered to myself, my pulse pounding. They're trying to break me. And for the first time, I wasn't running from it. I was ready for it. I had never seen a corporate building feel so much like an arena. The Vostek headquarters looked just as it always had. Sleek glass walls, towering chrome pillars, and those cold, polished floors that used to echo with my quiet footsteps when I'd come to bring Derek lunch. Back then, I always thought my place was in the background, out of sight and out of mind. Not that day. That day, I walked through those doors with my chin up, my hand resting on my belly, and Adrian Cole at my side. The receptionist's eyes went wide, which told me the gossip had already spread like wildfire. Elena Foster is here for the board meeting, Adrienne said. His voice was smooth, but carried a weight that no one would argue with. Yes, of course, Mr. Cole, the receptionist stammered. They're expecting you. Expecting me. The word made my chest feel tight. They weren't expecting the old Elena, the timid wife who used to apologize for taking up space. They were expecting a woman they planned to corner, to bully, and to break. But that woman wasn't the one who walked in. When the elevator doors opened on the executive floor, a hush fell over the area. The board members were all clustered by the glass wall, overlooking the park, talking in nervous whispers. Derek was standing apart from them, pacing in tight circles. His face was a storm of fear, anger, and something else I recognized. Panic. He froze solid the second he saw me. Elena, he breathed out. You shouldn't be here. I held his gaze. No, Derek, you shouldn't have brought me here. His jaw tightened, but before he could say another word, the chairman cleared his throat. Miss Foster, Mr. Cole, please join us. I stepped forward. My heartbeat was thundering in my ears, but when I spoke, my voice was steady. You asked for me. I'm here. We all moved into the boardroom. 12 chairs, 12 faces, all watching me. The room was humming with a tension so thick you could feel it. Derek sat across the table, his eyes trying to drill right through me. The chairman started. Miss Foster, we have been made aware of documents with your signature that are tied to some unusual financial activity. We need to understand your level of involvement. My fingers twisted in my lap under the table. I understand. Derek leaned forward then, his voice carefully controlled. Sweetheart, you don't have to do this. That word hit me like a slap in the face. Sweetheart. The same name he always used when getting me to sign documents I couldn't possibly understand. I remember Adrian's jaw clenching. I took a deep breath and finally spoke up. I told them I had no idea what I was signing. Derek had assured me it was all harmless, just business too complex for my simple mind. A little wave of whispers went through the room. The chairman held up a folder. He said, my signatures were on fund transfers to private accounts and asked if I knew. No, I said, a bit stronger that time. I knew nothing illegal. Derek had lied to me. Of course, Derek slammed his hand on the table, calling it a lie. That's when Adrian's voice went quiet and dangerous. She has proof. I reached into my bag for that little flash drive, and my hands were perfectly steady. I told them it was full of voice recordings of Derek pressuring me, telling me it was all routine, just a formality, nothing to worry about. I'll never forget the color draining from his face. He couldn't believe it. He just whispered, You recorded me? I had to, I told him. I knew one day he would try to make it all my fault. The chairman had them play the recordings, and there was Derek's voice, filling that stuffy room. So arrogant. Just sign it, Elena. Don't ask questions. You wouldn't get it anyway. When they ended, the silence was absolute. The chairman looked over at Derek and asked if he had anything to say. Derek's mouth opened, but nothing came out. And right then, honey, for the first time since we split up, I saw him clearly. He was just a terrified man who couldn't handle a woman he'd always seen as powerless. I sat up a little taller then, feeling a strength I never knew I possessed. I'm done hiding, I said, my voice soft. And I'm done letting him use me. Adrian caught my eye, and his expression was so proud. The power in that room had shifted. I wasn't the victim anymore. I was the one who could bring it all crashing down. The whole room just seemed to be holding its breath right at that moment. When the recordings were over, it felt like a spell had been broken. Something had just fundamentally changed. Derek Voss, the man who always walked around like he owned the very air people breathed, suddenly looked so pale and small. The chairman closed his file. "Miss Foster, thank you," he said. "This will be critical." That's when Derek jumped up, yelling, "Proceed with what?" He started his usual routine, calling me an unstable, lying ex-wife. But the chairman cut him off with a voice like ice. "Your explanations will come later. We've heard enough." It was a devastatingly quiet dismissal. Derek's eyes, full of rage, found mine. "You don't know what you've started," he snarled. I met his gaze without flinching and told him softly, "Yes, I do." Before he could say another word, the boardroom doors opened. Two officials from the SEC walked in. You could feel the shock ripple through the room. Even Adrian seemed a little surprised, though he hid it well. "Mr. Voss," one of them said, "we have some questions about financial irregularities at Vostek." Derek just stammered, "You know, it's a misunderstanding. I haven't done anything wrong." The official handed him some kind of notice. He explained it wasn't an arrest, but his cooperation was required. Right then, the humiliation hit Derek like a physical thing. I watched the board members exchange these cold, calculating glances. It was clear this wasn't about a messy divorce anymore. I was a corporate problem now. The chairman folded his hands. "Mr. Voss, you're suspended from all decision-making. Effective immediately." Silence. Then Derek just exploded. "Suspended?" he roared. "You believe her over me? She's nothing. She's—" That's when Adrian stood up. The room went dead quiet. "Choose your next words very carefully," Adrian said, and each word was delivered with this calm, chilling precision. Derek's mouth snapped shut. He knew, even in his rage, that Adrian wasn't a man you challenged. He had that quiet authority, the kind that's more powerful than shouting ever could be. The SEC men motioned for Derek to come with them, but he just stood there, looking at me with such betrayal in his eyes. "You didn't do this alone," he muttered. "He put you up to it." My voice was still steady when I answered him. "No, you did this to yourself." His face twisted in anger, and in that instant, everyone in the room saw the real him. Not a visionary or a leader, just a coward running from the truth. After the agents let him out, the room was silent. I let out a breath I didn't even know I was holding. That's when my hands started to shake under the table. Adrianen placed a steadying hand on my arm. "You did well," he murmured. I honestly didn't feel like I had. My heart was pounding. My vision was getting a little fuzzy. All the years of fear and humiliation were just pressing down on me. The chairman cleared his throat. "Miss Foster," he said, "I want to assure you that you are not under investigation. You are a crucial witness." I managed to nod, though I'm sure my voice trembled when I thanked him. He then told Adrienne that his firm's cooperation would be vital. Adrienne just gave a single, firm nod. "You'll have it." Leaving that building was a whole other ordeal. Camera flashes were going off everywhere. News crews, paparazzi, you name it. The story had gotten out so fast. I flinched, and Adrienne Istier put a hand on my back. "Stay close, Ta," he said, and I did. Because for the first time, people weren't looking at me with pity. They looked at me with a mix of curiosity and respect. For the first time, Elena Foster was a woman they couldn't just ignore, which of course was a huge problem for Leah Crane, who always had to control the story. Her whole life was about spinning tales, twisting the truth, and making lies go viral. She lived for the spotlight, as long as it was perfectly managed. But this time, that light was burning her. It wasn't flattering, it was harsh, and it was exposing all her secrets. Because when the news about Derek's suspension broke, the media didn't just stop with him. They started digging into the woman who had crafted his perfect image. They came for Leia. I heard later her phone was going crazy with calls and texts from reporters and angry clients. She just ignored it all. She was apparently in Derek's penthouse, pacing like a trapped animal, with the entire city watching her through those enormous windows. "This is bad," she kept whispering to herself. "This is really bad." Then she turned on the TV, and my face was on every channel. They weren't painting me as a scorned woman or a victim anymore, but as a credible witness. The headlines were all about the former wife exposing a huge financial scheme. It must have made her sick. This wasn't how her story was supposed to go. I was supposed to be a nobody, someone to be pitied and forgotten. I can just picture her throwing her glass against the wall, screaming, "How is she winning?" She was nothing. But deep down, she had to know. I had the one thing she never did: sincerity. And the truth, honey, always looks better on camera than lies do, especially when the lies are falling apart. When Derek finally got home with his lawyer, Leia apparently ran right at him. "Why didn't you tell me the SEC was looking into you?" she hissed. "Or that she had recordings." Derek just tried to walk past her, but she grabbed him. "No, right now," she snapped. "Everything is falling apart," she told him. "The media is saying I'm the mastermind who helped you hide money. You have to fix this." But then Derek turned on her, his eyes just blazing with anger. "Fix what?" he said. "You started half of this. You're the one who attacked Elena online and pushed her into a corner." Leia just scoffed, saying she thought I was weak and would just crumble. "Well, she didn't," Derek shot back. Then his voice dropped. "And now she has Adrian Cole backing her. You have no idea who you've decided to fight." She glared, asking if he thought she was scared of Adrian. "You should be," he said. And that's when she saw genuine fear on Derek's face, which scared her more than anything else. The next morning, she walked into her own PR firm, trying to look composed. She probably expected some gossip, but instead, her assistant was waiting for her. "Layla," she said softly, "the managing partners need to see you." And just like that, her world started to unravel too. She straightened up, thinking she'd finally turned the tables. But when she walked into that conference room, they all looked at her like a wounded animal. I heard the senior partner just said, "Leia, your contract is terminated, effective immediately." Those words just hit her like a ton of bricks. "Terminated?" she asked, her voice cracking. "You can't." But he shot back, "We can. You brought your mess into our firm." She stumbled back, insisting, "You need me. I built this place." But he was cold as ice. "No, you built yourself up, and now you're a problem." Security showed up and walked her out of her office, her building, her entire world. Standing on that sidewalk, her whole life collapsing, one truth must have hit her hard. It wasn't me who was losing anymore. It was her. And while all that was happening with Leia, I just barely caught my breath when Adrian asked me to come to his private penthouse office, this super secure place looking out over the East River. It wasn't his usual headquarters. This place felt different, quieter, darker, like it was made for secrets. When I walked in, he had his back to me, just staring at the city lights. He didn't have that calm confidence I was used to. He seemed so tense, coiled up, almost haunted. "Elena," he said, without even turning around, "we need to talk." My heart just dropped. You know how that sentence never leads to anything good. I walked toward him slowly. "Is something wrong with the investigation?" I asked. "No," he said. "Something is wrong with the truth." He turned then, and for the very first time, He looked vulnerable, not weak, just burdened, like he'd been carrying a secret for far too long. "I haven't told you everything about Derek," he said. I froze. What could he possibly mean? He pointed to a chair. "Sit, please." I sat down, but he kept standing, with his hands folded, his voice low but steady. "I didn't meet you by accident," he said. And oh, my blood ran cold. "You, what?" "I didn't know you personally," he explained, "but I knew of you long before that night in Queens." This strange, icy dread started creeping up my spine. "How?" I whispered. That's when Adrienne finally told me the whole story. He and Derek weren't just business rivals. They were partners 5 years ago on some big development fund. "I believed in him. I trusted him," he said, and I could hear the pain. "And he betrayed me." I could barely breathe as he kept talking. Derek had faked documents, moved funds around, and wrecked a deal that cost Adrienne's firm millions. He got away with it by framing a young analyst on his team. "A good man," he said, "who never worked again after that." My chest felt so tight. "So, you wanted revenge?" I asked. "No," Adrienne said, stepping closer. "I wanted accountability." But Derek was hidden behind lawyers and NDAs. He couldn't be touched legally, not without someone who knew his secrets, someone he'd completely underestimated. My heart was pounding so painfully in my chest. "You mean me?" It wasn't a question. It was just this awful realization dawning on me. "You are the key," he said, so softly. "You always were, because you were the only one he let close enough to see the truth without even knowing it." My throat got so tight. "And you thought you could use me?" I whispered. He actually flinched. "Yes, at first." That honesty, it stung more than a lie ever could have. I looked away, my eyes blurring. "So all of this, bringing me into meetings, helping me, protecting me, it was all just a strategy." "No," Adrian said, his voice firm. "Not anymore." He knelt down by my chair, making me look at him. "Elena, in the beginning, I saw you as leverage, but then I saw who you really are. A woman Derek tried to break and failed. A woman who deserved justice long before I ever got involved." My breath was shaky. "Why tell me now?" I asked. "Because you deserve the truth before we take the next step," he said. "And because I care about you, not as a tool, not as a strategy, as a person." My heart just twisted. I didn't doubt he meant it. His voice had this warmth, this crackle of emotion I'd never heard before. But the betrayal was still there. "So you used me," I whispered, "just like he did." Adrienne's jaw got tight. "Elena, I'm trying to undo what he did. I'm trying to make it right." "You should have told me," I said, wiping at my eyes. "I know," he whispered back. For a second, the room was just silent. Just the two of us, caught between the truth and all that hurt. Then my voice broke. "What do we do now?" Adrian stood up, his shoulders straightening. "Now," he said, "we bring Derek down for good. And this time, we do it together, with nothing left hidden." I took a shaky breath. The truth hurt, but it also made me stronger, because I finally understood something. Derek wasn't the only one who had underestimated me, and that mistake was about to cost him everything. Derek Voss, you see, had always believed empires fell because of something on the outside. A rival, a market crash, a public scandal. He never thought his own world would collapse from the inside. One board meeting, one little recording, and one woman he'd written off as nothing. But that's exactly what was happening. By the time he got back to Vostek the next morning, the place didn't even feel like his anymore. Security guards didn't nod at him. Assistants didn't scurry over. Conversations would die down the second he walked by. For the first time in his life, Derek was a stranger in his own kingdom. He stormed onto the executive floor, ready to take back control, but all he found was chaos. Board members were yelling, lawyers were rushing down the halls, phones were ringing off the hook, and every single screen was flashing the same news alert. SEC reviewing Vostech ledgers, possible corporate fraud. His stomach must have just dropped. He pushed into the boardroom and found his CFO, Grant Melville, talking to a group of directors with this grim look on his face. Grant looked up, startled. "Derek, you shouldn't be here. Don't you start with me," Derek snapped. "What's going on?" A board member stepped forward, all cold and businesslike. "The SEC requested full access to our financials. They have probable cause." "Probable cause?" Derek repeated, and I heard his voice was shaking with anger. "Based on what?" The chairman folded his hands. "Based on the anomalies tied to your wife's signature." "She's my ex-wife," Derek growled. "Exactly," the chairman said, which made her testimony even more credible. A dead silence fell over that room. Testimony. I had talked. I had turned on him. I had exposed him. "Elena," Derek whispered, just stunned. Grant let out a breath. "They believe she was coerced, used, manipulated." "She wasn't coerced," Derek shouted. "She knew what she was signing." But even he could hear the lie in his own voice, and so could everyone else. At that very moment, Vostech's top lawyer, a stern woman with these cold eyes, walked up to him with a thick stack of papers. "Mr. Voss, the board has unanimously voted to place you on immediate administrative leave, pending investigation." Derek just froze. "You don't have the authority." "We do," she said, so crisply. "Clause 14B of your employment agreement, misconduct threatening the company's stability." The chairman stepped forward. "Effective immediately. You have no decision-making power, no access to internal systems, no contact with staff." Derek felt the whole world tilt beneath him. "You can't do this," he roared. "We already have." He lunged for the conference table, grabbing the papers, his hands trembling as he scanned them. Suspension, asset freeze, access revocation. His entire empire, just gone in a stack of the signatures. "This is a witch hunt," Derek hissed. "Elena set this up. She's manipulating all of you." "No," Grant cut in, his voice quiet. "She didn't. Your ex-wife walked in and told the truth. Something you haven't done in years." Those words hit him like a punch. Derek just shook his head, desperate. "Adrian Cole. He's behind this. He wants to take everything from me." The chairman just replied, "Perhaps, but you're the one who gave him the ammunition." I heard Derek's chest tighten so much he had to grab a chair to stay upright. He needed someone, anyone, on his side. "Where's Leia?" he demanded. The board members all glanced at each other, uncomfortable. Grant sighed. "She's not coming." "What does that mean?" "It means," Grant told him, "that her firm fired her. She disappeared." And she refused to even speak with Derek's lawyer that day. Derek staggered. He had no one left, no mistress, no power, no credibility, just a collapsing empire, and a woman who'd risen from the ashes he tried to bury me in. When security finally came to escort him out, Derek barely put up a fight. His legs felt like they were made of concrete. His vision was blurry. He stumbled into the elevator that was once his golden throne, but was now just a cold metal coffin, taking him down, down, down. As the doors slid shut, one last thought must have stabbed him. It wasn't me who was his downfall. Underestimating me was. Layla Crane had always been able to land on her feet. A scandal, she'd spin it. Criticism, she'd twist it. Enemies, she'd charm them, but this time, her fall wasn't some dramatic show. It was silent, brutal, and terrifyingly real. After they walked her out of her own PR firm like some disgraced intern, she just wandered through Midtown in a daze, the cold wind cutting right through her coat. People rushed by, not giving her a second look. Her phone was buzzing nonstop. Unknown numbers, angry clients, reporters wanting a comment. She ignored every single one. By sunset, she ended up in some cheap little cafe she would have sneered at before, sitting all alone with a coffee that had gone cold. Her hands were shaking as she scrolled through her phone. It was a complete disaster. Every major news outlet had turned on her. Every story she tried to use against me had come flying back and hit her right in the face. PR director Leah Crane linked to Vostek's scandal. Then, insider claims she managed Derek Voss's damage control. And anonymous sources suggest Leah encouraged targeting ex-wife. Anonymous sources. Of course, it was Derek, the coward. I heard he'd fed the press just enough to try and pin it all on her, hoping it would buy him some time. A classic snake move, really. Throwing her right under the bus to save himself. I remember reading about it and thinking it was a dirty game. But the funny thing was, the more I saw, the more I realized no one was buying his story. The press, the public, they were done with him. And poor Leah, she just became the face of his scandal. Then the calls started coming for her. Her landlord called, telling her she had to be so out by next week because of her situation. It wasn't about the rent, he said, but the building's reputation. After that, her agent, her clients, everyone cut ties. Her reputation was in tatters. In just 12 hours, you see, Leah Crane went from being one of the most powerful women in the city to a complete pariah. I can only imagine her fury, the feeling of her world collapsing. She probably screamed my name, blaming me for it all. But deep down, I think even she knew the truth. It wasn't me who brought her down. It was her own choices. Desperate, she marched over to Derek's penthouse, shaking with anger and humiliation. I heard she pounded on his door until her knuckles were raw, yelling that she'd lost everything because of him, but there was only silence. She tried again, her voice cracking, reminding him they were supposed to be a team. Then, the lock finally clicked. But it wasn't Derek. It was his lawyer, cold as ice. He told her Mr. Voss wasn't seeing any visitors. Can you imagine the insult? She was no longer even important enough to be rejected by Derek himself. The lawyer just cut her off, stating that due to the investigation, it was in his client's best interest to sever all communication. She was being erased. He told her Derek had already moved on, and that if he were her, he'd get a lawyer immediately. Then the door closed right in her face. In that moment, she must have felt exactly as I had. Humiliated, thrown away, but where I had to learn to rise, she was just sinking. She'd backed the wrong man, and no one was there to catch her. When the queen rises, my love, the mistress is always the first to fall. While her world was ending, ours was just beginning. For the first time in months, I woke up without that awful weight on my chest. We were in the guest room at Adrienne's place. He'd insisted we stay there. The morning light felt so warm and gentle. I remember lying there, my hand on my belly, where you were peacefully sleeping, and I whispered to you, "We're safe now. We're not alone anymore." Just then, my phone buzzed. It was a text from Adrienne. The board's ruling was in. "Come to the office when you're ready," he wrote. Big day. My heart fluttered, but it wasn't fear this time. It was hope. I got dressed in a simple navy dress his assistant had bought for me. It wasn't flashy, just strong. like a woman who had walked through hell and come out holding the truth. Walking into that building felt so different. People didn't gawk at me anymore. They nodded, some even smiled. It was overwhelming, but in a good way. Adrienne was waiting in his office, standing by the window with all of Manhattan stretched out behind him. He looked so relieved to see me. "You made it," he said so softly. I gave him a little smile and replied, "You asked me to come." He let out a breath and said there was something I needed to see. He handed me a folder. I opened it, and my heart skipped a beat. It was the board's emergency vote. Vostek was appointing a temporary committee, and it was being overseen by Cole and Hawthorne. My eyes went wide. He was taking over, at least for a while, just to clean out all the corruption. And Derek? Adrian's jaw tightened when I asked. He told me Derek was finished, legally, financially, and publicly. There was no coming back for him. You know, it was a strange feeling, a mix of relief and a little bit of sorrow. I never actually wanted to see him destroyed. I just wanted my freedom. But I was learning that freedom sometimes requires that kind of justice. "Does this mean it's over?" I asked him. He just shook his head gently and said, "No, Elena. It means it's just beginning for you." Then he handed me a second document. It was a job offer with my name at the top, a consulting position with a salary that was more than I'd made in my entire life. My breath caught in my throat. I told him I couldn't possibly accept it, but he just said, "You earned it. You helped uncover the truth. Without you, none of this would have happened." Tears were blurring my vision by then. I whispered that he believed in me when I didn't even believe in myself. He stepped a little closer and corrected me softly. "You believed in yourself the moment you walked into that boardroom," he said. My heart just ached in a good way. Then he told me there was something else. His company had a penthouse in Midtown that had been empty for 2 years, furnished, safe, and big enough for a mother and her baby. It was ours, he said, if I wanted it. I was just speechless, shaking my head, overwhelmed. He insisted I was just accepting what I deserved. And in that moment, I let myself really look at him, the man who found me when I had nothing left and helped me find my own strength. For the first time, I felt a true, hopeful smile spread across my face. "Okay," I whispered. "I'll take the job and the penthouse." The relief on his face was so clear. "And Adrian," I added, "thank you." He just shook his head, his eyes so kind. "No, Elena, thank you." He told me the woman standing before him wasn't broken anymore. She was becoming unstoppable. After that, winter melted away, and our whole world changed. Our new home was a sanctuary, full of sunlight and peace. There were no footsteps to fear, just the soft, steady rhythm of you, reminding me that life had beautiful chapters left to write. The official investigation ended quickly. The evidence I had, even after all his manipulation, was solid. Derek Voss was charged with everything from financial misconduct to fraud. His assets were frozen, his empire collapsed. His name became a cautionary tale. For the first time, justice felt like a real, tangible thing. But our final meeting wasn't in a courtroom. It happened on a quiet Friday afternoon outside the Cole and Hawthorne building. I had just finished a meeting when I saw him standing there. He was a shell of the man he'd once been, tired, disheveled, with panic in his eyes. He said my name, his voice cracking. Adrian, who was walking behind me, tensed up immediately, but I gently put a hand up to stop him. I knew I had to face him alone. He pleaded with me just for a moment to talk. The desperation in his voice didn't move me anymore. "You ruined me," he whispered. "Everything I built is gone." I just looked at him calmly and asked, "Did you care when I was sleeping on the floor, carrying your child? Did you care when you forged my signature to protect yourself? He flinched. I made mistakes, he mumbled. No, I said, my voice steady as stone. You made choices. You chose greed. You chose cruelty. His shoulders sagged as he said he'd lost everything. I took a deep breath and told him the simple truth. No, Derek. You lost everything because you tried to take everything from me. He stared at me, and then he just broke. I'm sorry, he whispered. I'm truly sorry. And I just watched him, not with hate, but with a quiet, final peace. With a strange kind of pity, not anger, I remember telling him, so gently, "You're not sorry for hurting me. You're sorry for what you did to yourself." And when a tear ran down his face, I knew we were really done. I put my hand on my belly, feeling you in there, and said, "This part of my life is over, and you have no place in what comes next." He tried to speak, but he couldn't. It finally dawned on him, you see, that he'd let me go long before he ever thought I was worth holding on to. That night, Adrian, your grandpa, walked me home. The city lights were all soft and blurry. At my door, he stopped and said he had something to tell me. He said my strength didn't come from him. It came from me finally seeing myself the way he always had. He saw me as capable, as whole, all on my own. Then he said, his voice so earnest that when I was ready, he wanted to build a real life together. Not for any other reason, but because he truly admired me, because he cared. Before he could say more, I touched his chest and just smiled. I'm ready, I told him, for everything. The smile he gave me back was so unguarded and warm. For the first time since my world had fallen apart, I let myself imagine a happiness I had earned. A few months later, we were married at the Plaza Hotel. Manhattan was glittering outside the windows like a promise, and your mother, a sweet little toddler by then, held my hand as I walked to him. There were no more scandals, no more hiding. It was just healing, just us, just a future I had made for myself. Standing next to the man who showed me my own value, I knew this was never about revenge. It was about being born again. And that, my sweet, is how that chapter of our story closed. I hope you're still with me, listening to this old woman ramble on. I tell you all this because maybe a piece of my story feels familiar to you. Maybe my finding my own 2 feet reminds you of your own power. Or perhaps it's just a little whisper that the darkest nights do end. You know, there's an old idea I've always cherished. The obstacle is the path. I learned that the very things that felt like they were breaking me were actually putting me back together, but stronger this time. I didn't rise up because life got easier. I rose up because I decided I was worth it. That's a lesson I hope you carry with you. If you're ever in a hard place, remember that your pain doesn't get to name you. Who you decide to be after the hurt, that's your real story. This content was carefully researched, developed, and manually edited by our team to deliver meaningful stories with valuable life lessons. Every narrative is crafted to entertain, inspire, and empower our audience. We believe that great stories can change lives, and we are committed to bringing you content that matters. Thank you for being part of our community.